Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Ty.
Hi everyone and welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast. If you're a regular reader of the excellent Fly Fishing and Fly Time magazine, you'll know my guests love of fishing light lines, tying small flies and using long leaders. He's also a member of the Wild Trout Trust, Wild Fish Conservation, Grayling Society, chairman of his local Fly Dressers Guild, trustee of East Yorkshire Rivers Trust, and regional data coordinator for River Fly Partnership. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dave Southall to the podcast. Dave, it's great to have you along on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, I've even been fishing today.
Fantastic. How's that been?
I got a few. I was actually demonstrating Tenkara to John Bailey on Driffield Beck.
Fantastic. And that's that's an amazing stream in itself, isn't it? And I remember I fished it many, many years ago when the family first opened it up for day tickets. And it's an amazing river, isn't it?
It's a lovely river. Sadly, cormorants have wiped out most of the grayling, but what grayling are there are huge. You know, you're more likely to catch one over 2.5 pounds than under. Some very good wild brownies.
Yeah, I remember it was very, very windy there, and the rises were some of the subtlest I've seen. Is that the case that you experienced there, or was just what I happened to see on the day?
Oh yeah, they can be very, very finicky. I mean, today they were taking nymphs just subsurface, and it took an awful lot of casts to tempt each fish.
How's your rivers looking up there? I know that's obviously a chalk stream, but how are the rivers looking? As you know, down here we're sort of really, really dry. We haven't had rain for a number of weeks now. It seems as though I'm continually whinging about we've got too much rain or we haven't got any rain at the moment, but we haven't had any. And the rivers were sort of holding their heights really nicely and are just starting to drop back now. Are you experiencing similar?
We've got sort of mixed bag of things. Driffield Beck is fairly high because in February it was incredibly low, and we were considering, that it's going to be a really bad summer because it was at low summer level. But the rain in March has helped, and so it's put it up. It takes about a month for the rain to get through to the aquifers, but the North Yorkshire Moors streams are getting worryingly low. You know, they were a nice level in March. In fact, in March they were too high at times. And by the time of the trout season starting, which for us is 25th of March, they were up and down like a yo-yo. But they are getting worryingly low now because we haven't had any rain for a month.
And have you experienced this sort of the term I see a lot out in social media land is it's been a strange season with everything with the winter that we've had and then the spring and the rain and everything else that you mentioned, that it felt as though hatches were pushed back a bit. Have you seen a similar sort of case where you are?
Yeah, it's been very, very strange. I mean, on Driffield Beck, normally from 1st of April on, I would back dry fly against nymphs every time, but it's not been that case this time. You know, we've had very sparse hatches of olives. The hawthorns never developed because it was cold. We've had a cold east wind, which has held back hatches. And the only good hatches I've seen are actually been on the North Yorkshire Moors streams when they've been just a bit above normal and there's been quite cold and dull, so the duns have stayed on the water for a decent length of time. And I had one or two really good days when the fish were clonking large dark olives and large brook duns, one after the other.
That sounds an absolute dream. I often say here that we don't really get the fish rising to those till a little bit later in the year. But we've got mayfly right now, sort of. And it even took it. I don't know if you noticed with the rises and everything else that it took the fish quite some time to actually take them with any confidence. And I guess that is probably the delay that we've been experiencing. But have you found similar that for them to actually rise confidently took a bit more time too?
Yeah, the mayfly, normally I would reckon 25th of last month, they'd be coming up fairly steadily. And they've only just started taking the mayfly happily. And funnily enough, for the first time, I've seen a decent mayfly hatch on Driffield Beck, because at one time, all we saw were a few Ephemera vulgata, just a handful every year. But they seem to be increasing, and I think they're all vulgata because there's lots of vulgata down on the land drains towards Hull.
That's a fascinating point you make about mayfly, and actually for listeners as well. I believe there are three sorts, isn't there? There's the Danica vulgata, and is it Lineata?
Lineata,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
For the vulgata and the Danica, how could people actually tell the difference? Is there anything defining that you use to say, yes, I know that's not a Danica, it's a vulgata?
Yeah. The brown markings on the abdominal segments in vulgata are triangular, and they're very distinctive. Whereas on Danica, they're more rectangular and diffuse.
That is really cool. And that means we can impress our friends as well if we do spot them and say, right, okay, that might be a vulgata. So that's a great piece of information already. You say you're based in Yorkshire, and you've mentioned a number of rivers and moorland streams. Does that mean that you sort of fish to where you think the best conditions will be at that time in the season?
Yeah, I'll choose my fishery and the time of day according to what I think will happen. I mean, obviously, I'm not always correct, but I do have a range of fisheries that I can chop and change between.
And do you have a favourite? Is there one? You've mentioned Driffield a couple of times, but do you have a favourite somewhere you would consider what we might call your home water?
Well, my favourite, although I don't fish it as much as my home waters, is a little tiny stream on the North Yorkshire moors called the River Severn. That's seven as in the number seven. And there's unstocked, full of lovely little wild trout up to about 14 inches. If you get at 13 incher, it's a good one. And one or two very big grayling. In the past, they've been grayling up to 20 inches caught there. I haven't caught them that big, but I've caught them to over 1.5 pounds, which for a small moorland stream is good going in my books.
Yeah, it sounds that, absolutely. And would I be fair in saying that grayling occupy a similar sort of place in your heart as the trout, judging by what you've said so far?
I would say if I had to choose between grayling and trout, I'd choose grayling, because I find them far more challenging on dry fly. They're far more susceptible to micro drag. And I know all grayling are wild.
I like the sound of that. Do you have any tips? Because you said about the challenging and the drag, and I often have issues on the River X, certainly, the setting on the grayling. Sometimes I miss them, or the way they rise, I guess, and the shape of their mouth. Do you have any tips for setting on? Do you wait a little bit longer? Are you quicker? And sometimes they will follow the fly downstream as well, won't they? But do you have any tips for that?
Well, I have more success if I fish down and across than fishing upstream. And I do like shuttlecock emergers. I think they help. But there are days that they are just infuriating. I can remember one day on the Yorkshire Derwent when I was fishing a glide that the fish are always midging, and I was fishing my usual size 24 short shank CDC midge, and I must have missed 50 takes in a row. And in the end, I gave up, and I felt as I'd really been fed humble pie. I went round the corner, and there were fish rising to egg-laying caddis, and I had 20 fish in about 25 casts. Yeah, it was just crazy. Why? I mean, I've read Oliver Edwards' theories about grayling takes, but there are times that they just infuriate. I've even watched Tippett diving, by waiting a bit longer and struck nothing. And you think, what the dickens do I do?
Dave, you've made me feel so much better already. I'm so pleased you're along today. So thank you for that. And that downstream presentation, then I'm guessing that allows you have to wait a little bit longer to set on them if they're downstream. Would that be right, or is there anything?
Yeah, well, often they seem to come up and they take on the turn, so they're facing downstream. The other thing I find is that I can often get much better drifts fishing across and downstream, doing a dump cast, come reach cast, stopping the rod high and then tracking the rod down, and even sometimes walking a pace or two. Because one time on the Socha in Slovenia, the grayling were coming up from about 7 feet deep, and we were having to get 15-foot drag-free drifts, before they'd taken. I mean, even then it was sort of 30 casts per grayling because 29 casts just didn't get the drift right.
Wow. And that Slovenia must have been, I guess, I've not been there and I've not been to the San in Poland, which I believe may be a similar sort of case. That's a pretty good school to learn a little bit about tricky presentations, tricky fish and drag-free drifts, mustn't it?
Yeah, well, I think, everywhere we're grayling on dry fly, it's drag-free drifts. I mean, even on my local small moorland becks that have got tiny little grayling, in general, even the little grayling look at your fly and say, "You're rubbish, mate. Do it better next time."
Absolutely love that. That's fabulous. Wintertime, then, we traditionally think of grayling. Obviously, they're not too far around the corner now. This is early July, first week of June. Sorry, this is being recorded. But grayling traditionally, or certainly more recently, have been thought of a winter fish. Does that mean that you'll wait for them to rise? And are the rivers that you're fishing good places for them to rise throughout the winter as well?
It varies. Some of the industrial West Yorkshire rivers that I fish, there are certain places that I know there'll be midge hatches, even on the coldest day. And I've had grayling right through the winter, and a few times I've been with a friend and he's fished his team of 2 or 3 Euro nymphing setups, and I've caught just as many or sometimes even more fish fishing a size 30 CDC midge to fish that are rising. But I stay flexible. My setups are adaptable for dry fly, Euro nymphing. I don't take 2 rods or different reels, and I play it by what I see. Stu Crofts has got a brilliant saying: "You've got to let the river invite you in and let nature tell you what to do." And I try to use his mantra.
That's some great advice there, and I like what you're saying. My next question, funnily enough, was going to be dry fly or nymph, but I suspect. But I guess you can say both. I guess you would say both, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I much prefer dry fly, but on my local Driffield beck, which has very few grayling because of cormorants, the grayling population's dropped by 99%, at least 99%. So there's just a handful of grayling, which are huge, and they virtually never rise to a dry fly. So, it's shrimp imitations generally that I use. Although, having said that, not last January, but the January before, I was fishing up on the Driffield Anglers Water as a guest. And 6th of January, there was a hatch of blue-winged olives. I saw a good grayling rise, missed it, but had it on for a second or so. And then I saw another big one rise, but it refused my dry, so I put a nymph on after I'd covered it repeatedly. And that proved to be a real clonker at just over 3 pounds. And then later on in the day, I had another 2 grayling on the dry, but smaller fish. I will fish dry if I can, but I do nymph fish if I have to.
And it sounds like it was worth it. £3 is that sort of almost holy grail for grayling, isn't it?
It is for most people. I mean, on Driffield Beck, you're actually more likely to catch a grayling over 2.5 pounds than under. But on a good day, I might see 3 grayling in a 4-hour session, and it's clear enough to sight fish most of the time. There are very, very few fish, but what are there are in general very big.
That does sound fantastic. I remember, as I said, thinking back about that place, and it's all coming rushing back to me now, and thinking that we did spot a few of them, if I remember rightly as well. But yeah, sounds an amazing piece of water. But I wanted to move on a little bit and find out about yourself. We're sort of learning and getting a sense of you as an angler, and many people, myself included, have probably read about the articles that you've written over a number of years now. But how would you describe yourself as an angler for listeners?
Well, I try to fish imitatively. I've always been interested in natural history and ecology. I make as many mistakes as a lot of people. I don't consider myself to be sort of extraordinary. I fish hard and I've learnt a lot. So my hunches are usually right. And my casting has improved, but it still needs to be improved further. As I said to you before we started the podcast, the more I know I don't know. And I think it's easy to get big-headed if you fish somewhere like Driffield Beck, for instance. I catch some huge grayling and some huge wild trout, but not everybody has access to that sort of water. And I think folks who think that those folks who are catching loads of big fish are sort of special people are probably very misguided. Yeah, some of us are reasonably adept, but I know I've still got an awful long way to go. And at 75, I'm probably not going to get to the level that I would love to get.
Do you think that's what makes you come back so much for fishing then? That's why you love it so much still?
Yeah, I always find there's more and more to learn, more and more techniques to develop, more and more exploration to do. And I know that I will never know it all. And every day is different, every water's different. I love exploring new waters. And when I've gone abroad, I've very, very rarely used guides because I much prefer to do it myself. And I'm not into competition fishing. If I see an otter, I like to just sit and watch it for as long as I get the chance. And I must admit, when I first started fly fishing, I used to go on my own because I knew I'd catch more fish. But now I much prefer social fishing, particularly just wandering up a river with a friend and just fishing alternate fish.
Yeah, it's a fun way to fish, isn't it? And sharing that experience. And I think Jethro, I did a podcast with a little while back, said it's almost like a team effort, isn't it? Because you're sort of helping each other out. And I know somebody I fished with recently, it was, I don't know if you find this, that if you're sort of spotting for a friend, sometimes your directions, because you're not holding the rod, you're not in that moment of that rising fish, your directions or where you've spotted the fish can sometimes be a little bit more accurate and also can help your friend perhaps find that fish too.
Yeah. I mean, I think fishing together, especially if you're sight fishing, can be really useful. When I went to New Zealand, I actually fished with a New Zealand friend, and when you're down at water level, you can't see anywhere near as much as you can further up. So he'd hide up on the bank behind a bit of cover and he'd say, no, get that fly another 3 feet upstream, or a bit to the right, no, a bit to the left, So you can be much more precise with your presentations if you have got somebody else as a spotter. And sometimes, you see a fish and I'll say to a friend, oh, look, one row's just behind that branch. Just get your fly there.
Yeah, that can be the fun part of it. And there's also that part, I don't know how you feel with it, and it comes back to a lot of what we talk about, picking the right sort of fishing friend, that you're completely comfortable in their company as well. Because I know I've sometimes fished with people, I'm sort of a little nervous because you think, oh God, if I stuff this fish, I'm in trouble or whatever. But when you find a fishing buddy, it doesn't matter, does it? And you can both laugh if you miss it, or equally get as excited as when the fish is in the net too.
Yeah, I think, I totally agree. Having the right fishing companions. I mean, I can remember going on Tenkara Syndicate waters up above Lady Bar Reservoir with Stuart Crofts and my friend Steve. And I mean, the fish rise like lightning there, little tiny streams. And we just ended up killing ourselves saying, who's going to miss the most bites in a row? And I think it was either Stu Crofts or me. It was 7 or 8 bites, rises in a row that we missed.
And that makes us feel all a little bit more human. If you and Stuart Crofts are missing them, then I feel a whole lot better. And it was fascinating what you were saying about it, wasn't it? That everyone is human and everyone gets caught up in a tree. Everyone misses a fish. It doesn't matter, does it?
No. I mean, I do Facebook posts, and I post my Captain Catastrophe days as well as my successful days.
I think that's a great way to do it as well. And yeah, absolutely. I think I've done those in the past as well. But yes, there's nothing like when it goes to plan, and we're all very pleased about that. But it's part of that learning process, isn't it? That we've never, as you said, fully got on top of it. And as a result of it, we keep coming back for more. And as you so rightly put, that every day's different, isn't it? And, I'm going down to the river tomorrow. I've got my friend Warren coming down. I've left it alone because we're going to fish it for, the whole day and hopefully even get a spinner full. And I've no idea what it's going to be like. I've got a sense of what it might be like. But I was down there, whenever it was, Sunday or whatever it was, Monday, I can't remember now. And it could be completely different, couldn't it?
Oh, very much so. It's you can't go with the preconceived idea. You go with you go with some idea of what you're expecting, but you've got to stay versatile.
And that's a very good point, isn't it? And I used to call it the Montana thing, that if you were fishing around a still water, people would say, what are you catching on? And everyone's probably going to say something different, but it's easy to tie on what you had on last time. But I suspect you're the sort of angler that gets to the river, watches for a bit, and as you said so eloquently earlier as well, that you're waiting for clues and for the river to give you a clue before you tied on, instead of tying on what worked last time.
Yeah, well, I must admit, I often tie on an LK caddis just to keep the line under control when I'm walking, because that usually works most places most of the time. But as soon as I get to the river, I'm looking for what's happening. And I mean, a classic case was a few years back when Don Stasica came to do an article about Pickering Beck for Trout and Salmon magazine. And it was middle of the mayfly, so we thought mayfly. But the fish weren't rising to mayfly, they were rising to aphids. So we caught nearly all of our fish on size 30 CDC dries.
And that's thrilling when you spot those sorts of things as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and yet there are some people say, "Oh, it's mayfly time. I'm going to fish a mayfly," and they don't think of using anything else. And then they say at the end of the day, "Oh, they weren't going well today."
Yeah, I know what you mean about that. I caught some fish on mayfly week before last or last week, and I thought, oh, here they come, and then it's been small little. There's been olive uprights, so I've been fishing the emerger stage there and catching some fish that way, rather than those splashy, slashy takes that I've got my fingers crossed while I'm saying this, that hopefully I may see tomorrow. But yeah, that being able to watch and as I've sort of implied there, you're looking for those rises as well, and you're looking to interpret those rises too, I guess, as well, aren't you? As to, what stage of the hatch they're on. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. I mean, classic case on our Driffield Beck is Agapetus pupae, or strictly speaking, they're farrate adults, because the pupa's the chrysalis that's in the stone case at the bottom of the river. And it wasn't till Stu Crofts pointed out that it was the Farrate adult swimming to the surface, then swimming to the bank, because unlike other caddis that will emerge at the surface, the agapetus swim to the bank before they unfurl the wings. And I can remember a few days when the river's been covered with hawthorn flies or black gnats or a smorgasbord of olives, and the fish have been rising quite aggressively. And, you put your olive on, nothing. You put your black gnat or hawthorn fly, nothing. And you think, oh, it's drag. That's why they're not taking it. And then you see a few agapetus, which are little 5mm brown moths, scuttling about in the bankside vegetation. And you think, I should have realised from the way those fish were swirling vigorously at the surface that they were taking agapetus as they were swimming in the surface. So pop a size 20 Stu Crofts agapetus on and bang, you've got fish after fish when you've blanked for an hour.
Nice tip. And do the fish follow them right into the bank as well? Will they move a distance to eat them?
Oh, they'll move a distance, yeah. I mean, it's amazing because they're only tiny little 5mm long brown jobbies, like a skinny water boatman. And the fish will move sort of 15 feet, 5 meters to take them at times. I mean, sometimes they're actually taking the olive nymphs under the surface. And that's sometimes the tricky thing, working out whether they're taking nymphs of the hatching olives just subsurface or whether they're taking agapetus. And if they're taking nymphs just below the surface, I'll often fish a lightweight nymph or a small Sawyer pheasant tail, and I'll grease my leader right up to the fly. So the fly's just sat in the surface. And if that doesn't work, then I know that it's definitely agapetus, and I pop on a Stu Crofts agapetus.
And when do they hatch? Are they hatching throughout the year, or is there a particular time? Because it'd be great for us listeners, and I include myself in that, to keep an eye out. And I'd love to hear from people if they're spotting this hatch as well. When should we be looking for it? Have we missed it?
Yeah, well, there's several species of agapetus, but the most common species are Agapetus fuscipes, which we get on our chalk streams here, and they emerge during the day. So anytime during the day, they can start as early May, sometimes even this year, they were started middle of April, but only in small numbers. The main sort of bulk of them are sort of end of May, June, July, sometimes into August. And then there's Agapetus ochripes, which is on the spate streams on the North Yorkshire moors, and they emerge in the evening. So, if I see trout and grayling rising to vigorously to what I call invisibles, I suspect it's agapetus. But the main way to find out whether your river's an agapetus river is just look on the bottom. And if there are lots of little 5mm pebble igloos, then you've got agapetus. And I mean, on Driffield Beck, in a good agapetus year, I can get 8,000 in a 3-minute kick sample. And the ranunculus looks as though it's covered with dandruff because of all these little tiny white pebble cases.
That is extraordinary, and I've definitely got those. So, and I think ours tend to be middle to back end of June, because I always say that the mayfly ends, the fish go quiet for a bit, the midges get going, all the midges are hatching all the time, but they're getting go, and then it's caddis, and I bet that's the hatch as well. So I'm thrilled to have learned something, and I'm going to look a little bit deeper into that. And that what you said about the fishing in the film, greasing up the leader all the way almost to the end, is a wonderful tip as well, particularly if we're looking at that hatch more closely now as well. And I'd be fascinated to know from listeners as well, if you've turned over some rocks, if you found some of these agapetus. I'm going to learn some more. I use, because there's so many species of caddis, aren't there?
Oh, dozens and dozens. And for most of them, when they're emerging, a clinkhammer for the emerger or an L-care caddis or an F-fly does the job. But with agapetus, the adults, you never see them on the water. I've discussed with Stuart Crofts about it, and we both think that what they do is just crawl down bankside vegetation, a bit like Granham. Granham often, I mean, I can remember one day on the Eden in Cumbria, and my waders looked as though they're covered with green snot because of all the Granham that had crawled down my waders to lay eggs underwater.
Amazing. And are you still seeing how, from you've been fly fishing quite some time now? Have you noticed that is there a big noticeable change in the hatches that you've obviously described there? But have you seen changes, and the hatches, are they as good, or are they not quite as good as they were?
It depends on the rivers. The industrial West Yorkshire rivers, and I believe the same is true of the industrial rivers of Lancashire, have improved dramatically. A friend of mine used to live in Huddersfield, and he's the same age as me, mid-70s. And he says when he was a kid in Huddersfield, they could tell which day of the week it was by the colour of the river because of the dye that had was been dumped in from the woolen industry. Whereas now those rivers are full of trout and grayling, and have pretty good hatches at times. Whereas the rivers that were clean tend to have declined. Driffield Beck is not what it was. It still has good hatches up at the top, but lower down, we've got trout farm and agrochemicals probably getting in as well. And I mean, you may have seen in the press about Oxfalls and Costa Beck up at Pickering, which was a spring-fed limestone stream, which was full of grayling, full of trout, and it was just polluted to death. And it's now gone to judicial review, actually has the pollution, which, I mean, it's 20 years since it started. So it worries me that a lot of our rivers are not good. Hopefully all the furor about the water companies and sewage will have some impact, but I'm not holding my breath.
No, I'm slightly worried about that as well. And I was just thinking about it the other day that, the water companies are saying, well, we're really sorry, but we are going to charge you to improve it. And I wonder if that is a mechanism for turning it back on the people who are fighting. Well, we're going to keep charging more, charging users more so that they improve it. So keep your voices down. Do you think there's an element of that to it as well?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised, but I equally wouldn't be surprised if they just say the right things but don't do the right things.
Yeah, the news has been amazing though, and I don't know if on your local news, but certainly down here in the West Country, that they're carrying a lot about pollution regularly. Not so long ago, it was almost weekly that there was something on the local news about it, and I think the difficult thing, isn't it, that it's keeping that sort of momentum with people, because with these the water companies apologising, that's sort of taken the wind out, the news story away a little bit as well, hasn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, one reason I'm involved with the Riverfly Partnership, citizen science sampling of the invertebrates, is because I'm really concerned about the state of our rivers.
And have you seen, since you've been doing the sampling, have you seen something noticeable there, even in that short time since those surveys have been running?
Well, I mean, recently I've seen a slight improvement on Driffield Beck in the lower reaches, because I believe that the local trout farm has cut down their production. But the classic case was 2002. I was asked to invertebrate sample on the Yorkshire Rye up at Nunnington. And when I sampled, there were masses of blue-winged olive nymphs and virtually nothing else. They'd lost the mayfly. The crayfish had disappeared, the gammarus had disappeared, which was why it was the mayfly hatch that they were concerned about and why they called me in July. And it was obvious what had happened. There was lots of straw soaked in disinfectant spread over all the roads during the foot and mouth in 2001. And that had gone into the rivers and just wiped them clean. blue-winged olives had obviously flown in from some of the moorland streams, egg-laid, and no competition, so their population exploded. And it took 4 years before the river really started to improve. And even after 10 years, the Gamras hadn't recovered fully. But it is interesting. It's interesting in river management because I did a research project for the North Yorkshire Moors Park and the EA many years back, again on the River Rye. And there was a very heavily shaded bit of river that had got a very high north-facing bank. So it was very, very shaded. And they selectively removed some of these very old alder trees that hadn't been pollarded for a century. And it doubled the invertebrate numbers in the river, did selective opening. But, again, it's all a case of balancing, because remove too many trees, water warms up with global warming, and you end up with damaging the environment because it gets too hot and depleted of oxygen.
It's fascinating what you say, isn't it, about nature? And I often say here that given half a chance, it'll do its utmost to try and sort itself out. And also, I had something the other day, and you talked about blue-winged olives coming into the river. I'm assuming, and it's been with these northerlies and everything else, it's been quite windy. And my little pond in my garden now, I have a river that is quarter of a mile away. I found a mayfly spinner on there the other evening, just the one, and it wasn't there in the morning, so I don't know if my little fish had made a meal of it. But are you aware, or do you have any sense of how far flies will actually move? Is that part of that process of reproduction and movement for them to try and move as far as they possibly can to keep the genes?
They will disperse, especially in windy conditions. I mean, for years, March browns were just not seen on the spate rivers in Yorkshire. They were found Scotland and Wales and Cumbria, but we've got increasing numbers on some of our Yorkshire rivers now. And there's no doubt that insects can move prodigious distances if the wind is the right direction. And I mean, of course, we see the migrations of granum upstream to egg lay and other ephemerids, because, of course, if they never moved upstream, there'd be that drift of the nymphs downstream and the eggs, and they'd eventually end up breeding in the sea if they could. So, I mean, they will migrate and recolonize, and it's amazing nature's capacity to recover, as you say, if you give it a chance.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I'm sure many of us will continue to try and fight the corner there as well. But I wanted to move on to some fishing. As I said in the introduction, I've over the years enjoyed reading about, as somebody who's also used light lines, and I know we were talking about them before we started recording. But I wonder, what came first for you? Was it light lines or small flies?
Definitely light lines. I used to fish as a teenager and into my early 20s, fly fishing. And I had 4-weight gear, which was considered dead light at the time. But then I came back to fly fishing after a 20-odd year layoff in I've noted it down so I didn't forget, 1998, after a mountain bike accident. And I noticed, fishing with a friend of mine, that he was catching more fish than I was. He was using a 3-weight line. I was using either a 4 or a 5-weight line. So I thought, well, we seem to be fishing exactly the same length leaders and flies and such. And I know there are other variables, but I thought one possible reason was that I was fishing heavier gear. So in 2001, I bought an Orvis 1-weight rod. I saw a review of it I think it was in Fly Fishing and Fly Tying, which I didn't write at the time because I was only just getting back into fly fishing. But I did buy the magazine because there was Malcolm Greenhalgh, Oliver Edwards, and Stu Crofts and such who I rode the back of to get back onto some sense of speed. And I did find that the one weight improved my catches, or at least I think I did, because obviously you're learning over the years. But at that time, I found casting a one weight line, even with the one weight rod, was tough going. So I used to use it with a 2 weight. Now I'll use it with a 0 weight because I've actually improved my casting thanks to the help of friends.
And that was one of the problems then, wasn't it? Was finding light line rods, and particularly light lines themselves as well. It was quite difficult to do, wasn't it? And I remember the first one I bought, and I was talking to somebody, Theo Pike, if you're listening as well. I know you've got one, and I still use it and think it's fabulous. But at the time, they were very much derided as sort of almost toys or windlass day rods when they were anything but, really, weren't they?
Yeah. Well, in 1970, I built myself some rods from Hardy fibre tube blanks, and I actually built a 6-foot rod for a 3.5 weight line. And Hardy's made a special line for it. And people thought it was absolutely crazily light. But for the small streams I was fishing, it was ideal. Now I think of a 3-weight setup as my heavy setup for windy days. At least on rivers, I virtually never fish heavier than a 3-weight, even when I'm fishing streamers. I'll fish a heavier rod. I'll fish a 6-weight rod, but with a 3-weight line. Thanks to Italian casting that I was taught, which you won't automatically underline the rod because of the technique, which loads the rod very effectively. But I am convinced that light lines and long leaders are a big advantage. And I have even seen on Driffield Beck, when the fish have been spooky, fish bolt when I've been fishing an 18-foot leader and a 1-weight line. And I've actually seen them bolt when I've been using Tenkara and carelessly just landed the 8-pound fluorocarbon casting line on the water. So, when they're in that mood, they can be very, very spooky. And grayling with nymphs, sometimes I've had them spook when a nymph with a 2mm bead hits the water. At other times, I've had to fish a heavier bead, and they've actually shot forward, and I've thought, it was spooked, and they've taken a fly. Fish are unpredictable. They can be unbelievably spooky. And I was saying to a guy a couple of days back, if they're not really on feed, they can be so spooky. That day I was having to do 40-foot casts to stand any chance, and I hate fishing at range. And even then, the fish were often bolting when they saw me 40 feet downstream of them. And yet, when they're on agapitas, for instance, you can jump up and down, throw bricks. Well, maybe not throw bricks, but you can be incredibly clumsy with your casting. You can hook and drop off a fish, misstrike, and 30 seconds later they're up like a metronome feeding again.
That's wonderful to hear. And I was thinking about, there's a couple of things. You mentioned Italian casting, and I remember Eat Sleep Fish used to wrote a number of articles for us, didn't you, about Italian casting a few years back now as well. Yeah. And I was thinking also what you said about the Orvis rod, because I'm guessing, I think I had a later version of it, the trout palm in a 1-weight as well. And I think they were 7.5-foot rods. And now we're really lucky that we've got longer, lighter rods, and that plays beautifully in. And I can see now that you were very synonymous with the explosion of Tenkara as well, which must have suited your fishing needs absolutely perfectly.
Well, 2010, I became aware of Tenkara. A friend of mine from my local fly dressers sort of said to me, "What do you know about Tenkara?" And I just said, "Well, I've read a little bit about it in an article in Fly Fishing and Fry Time. It's just an old-fashioned Japanese method, like Isaac Walton and Cotton and Co. it's not really relevant to me. But it made me look at the Tenkara USA website, and I saw their videos, and I thought, this is just what my friends and I had been trying to do on the alpine streams in Austria, high sticking with a 10-foot four-weight rod and a 14-foot leader, trying to keep all the line and as much tippet as possible off the water. And I thought, it's just much more efficient, 13-foot, 14-foot, 15-foot rod with 10-pound fluorocarbon, well, 10-pound, 15-pound copolymer we've started off with. Ended up going on to fluorocarbon lines, with 8 or 10-pound fluorocarbon casting line. And basically, we tripled our catch rates on alpine streams. And on some of the really pockety alpine streams, we increased our catch rate tenfold. I mean, I can remember one day on an alpine stream where we'd really struggled before. We ended up with 200 fish apiece. It was just crazy, because you could drop a big chinobilant or a big size 10 clinkhammer into a dinner plate sized pocket of calm in a maelstrom of white water and leave it there. And if the fish didn't take it static, just tap the rod, the tip quivered, you'd got direct contact to the fly, so the fly quivered, and bang, up would come a brook trout or a brown trout or a naturalised rainbow. It was just revolutionary. And in fact, 2012, my friend Steve and I took Don Staziker and Stu Crofts up to the Austrian Alps, and it just blowed our minds. I mean, I had one day with Stuart where we just looked for this craziest tiny pocket of calm to catch a fish, and we just giggled all day with some of the spots that we caught fish from that you could never even have attempted with a conventional setup.
Yeah, I remember the video, Daniel Gallardo, sorry if I've mispronounced that, when Tenkara USA, when he first started getting going, and it was showing him similarly fishing an elk hair in some pocket water. And I thought Dartmoor immediately and bought one within, minutes. Are you still using that technique of fishing?
I use it where it's applicable. When I first got into Tenkara, I used it everywhere. Lakes, slow rivers, everywhere, just to find out what it would do. And I tried everything from, shot gum to coat with big fish and pole elastic to coat with big fish, and realised that with pole elastic, the fish just went where it wanted. It got no control. But I was just experimenting. And now I use it where I think it will work. Brilliant for grayling, for Euro nymph style fishing, because you can get near to them even in slower water. And with 5x tippet, it'll cope with really big grayling, providing they're not in fast water. I mean, I've had grayling to £3.4 from Driffield Beck on Tenkara gear from one pool where there's a real fast flow my side, the far side's a different club, and to fish over the seam, you can actually drop your shrimp over, keep your coloured indicator just above the water, and there's nothing getting into that fast flow. So, on somewhere like the upper tees, I wouldn't consider using a conventional rod because the trout are small, you've got complex flows, and I know that I can at least double my catches or treble my catches with Tenkara compared to using conventional gear there.
Do you think that the Tenkara scene hasn't grown because of the reasons that we were just talking about, that it was easier to get longer, lighter trout gear? Or do you think it just didn't follow through in the way people hoped, or a combination of both? What do you think?
I think, in the UK, we've not got many waters that are ideal Tenkara waters. It is brilliant for complex, boisterous pocket water, that can't be fished with conventional gear. I mean, I can remember in Austria coming back to the hotel one time, and we'd fish the same river as some guys with conventional gear. And they said, "How many fish have you caught?" And we said, 50 odd a piece, and they'd blanked, and they thought we were lying. But, we wouldn't have even dreamed of using a conventional rod there. But most of our UK rivers aren't tumbling. I mean, the Dartmoor streams are brilliant for tenkara, and I've fished tenkara there. Somewhere like the North Dart and such are perfect for tenkara. And you've not got fish that are way too big, because tenkara does have a limit as to the size of fish, because 5x tippet's the maximum that is recommended because of the risk of breaking the rods. And I know in Austria, my friend Steve broke 2 tenkara rods in 2 days on big rainbows in one of the pocket water streams. So, I think there was a spell when a lot of people got into tenkara and bought tenkara rods to try them out. And then I think a lot of them realised that on their waters, they didn't get any real advantage from tenkara. And of course, now you can get 11, even 12-foot conventional rods, which you can fish in effect tenkara style with just a French leader out of the rod top. And today, when I was demonstrating to John Bailey tenkara, I actually showed him a setup that I use for big fish with tenkara style fishing, which is a 10'6" 0-weight rod that's very soft. And I use that with 8-pound fluorocarbon casting line. And it's fine for fishing at a range of about 20 feet or so, 20, 25 feet. And you've got running line, so you can actually play big fish without going, oh, hell, what's going to happen? Snap.
Yeah. And you talk about the action of the rod there as well. And that's quite interesting, given that the size of fish that you've been catching along the way as well. And that action definitely helps, that softer action, as you described there. And I'm thinking about tenkara rods as well, and that's definitely an aid in suppressing some of those bigger fish, isn't it?
Yeah, I've definitely gone towards softer, crisp rods, but that bend right down to the butt. They're not as easy to cast as fast action rods. I mean, I can remember when everybody was into really fast, stiff rods, and they said, "Oh, the timing's critical on them." I never found that. But I did find that I snapped off on the strike fairly often, or when I got a fish plunging underneath the rod tip with light tippet. So the only time I now use sort of relatively stiff, fast rods is if I'm going into jungle warfare on a section of Driffield Beck that's got loads of submerged willows at dusk with 9-pound tippet, a size 4 Elcare caddis tied onto a heavy grade hook, and I'm going to fish a 6-weight and hit and hold. But for everything else, I like a nice, easy action rod. And I mean, the 10-foot 4-weight that I use now, I can cast a 1-weight line comfortably with it at distance. I can cast a 4-weight line. I can even cast, a French leader with a dry fly, or a Euro nymph line with a 10-foot leader and a dry fly. It's so versatile.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to move on to flies as well, because we've covered so much already, but I wanted to talk about flies. And the reason I asked about the light lines was obviously because of the size of flies that you like to fish as well. When did you really first get tied in with these small patterns and realised that they were a really important part of your arsenal?
Well, 2003 was the first 2001 really. I couldn't fish some of the rivers because of foot and mouth. And I fished my local small still water, which is fed from the local chalk streams. And the rainbows there just didn't want to know normal size flies. They were feeding on micro buzzers, as I call them. And when I take a gentle syringe out of the throat with a Stu Crofts syringe, there's usually nothing bigger than 5 millimeters, and often nothing bigger than 3 millimeters long with respect to buzzers. So I could see these tiny midges coming off and the tiny midge pupae in the surface. So I managed to source some size 22 short shank hooks, tied some shuttlecocks on them, and started catching. In 2003, I became aware of the importance of small flies in rivers. I was fishing the Yorkshire Rye, and there was a good hatch of olives, and the grayling and brown trout were totally ignoring my size 18 olive imitations. And there were lots of little tiny midges. And by then I'd got down to size 24s. So I put a size 24 CDC IOBO humpy on, and bang, I was catching fish. And then later on in the day, I found another straight. There were no midges. There were loads of olives, but there were thunderbugs or thrips. I mean, they're tiny. They're 2 millimeters long and about 0.5 millimeter diameter. There's no way you can imitate them. The fish wouldn't take the size 24 as it was. So I trimmed the size 24 right down. So it was just a skinny CDC body, which I applied plenty of floatant to keep it on the surface. And I started catching. And on recent years, I've gone smaller and smaller. I mean, one day on the River Colne near Huddersfield, I was there fishing with Stu Crofts and a couple of other friends. And it was November and the river was covered with sycamore leaves and covered with aphids. And the grayling were just going balmy. So I put a size 24 CDC IOBO humpy with a fat body, because I'd prefer to use as big a hook as I can get away with, because I know I can get better presentation with bigger flies. And I was probably getting a take every 6th or 8th drift. But a lot of the time I could see the fish coming up and looking at my fly and saying, "No, you crap, mate, do it better next drift. No, you crap, mate, do it better next drift." So I put a size 30 short shank CDC on, and I was getting fish nearly every drift. And I had the same this last winter on the River Don near Sheffield. I was basically nymphing, but then there was a hatch of tiny midges. I put a size 22 shuttlecock on, and I watched one grayling come up 4 times and look at it and turn away. I put a size 30 on, and I rose it 5 times and missed it 5 times in succession. And the 6th time it took confidently and I hooked it, but I couldn't get it to take the size 22. But there's 30 every go, every chuck of coconut. It was just me missing it.
Fantastic. And I'm guessing that that size of fly as well, because I remember when the Mariano partridge hooks came out, maybe the first ones I was aware of that were certainly smaller, but you're talking about size 30 there and the patterns and a shuttlecock pattern. I guess that small, a shuttlecock, because I think probably one of the things that put many of us off fishing these smaller flies is being able to see them on the water. But it seems to me that shuttlecock, you're probably going to see okay on the water, aren't you? Relative.
Yeah, and even this, what I call my minimalistic micro midge, which is just a tip of a CDC feather whacked onto a hook. Nothing else, just a bit of 8/0 tan thread and a little bit of CDC stuck on the end. And I find I'm fishing as close a range as I can get away with, 20 feet if possible. 30 feet. Beyond that, it's getting long range, particularly for grayling. And I can usually see them, but I just use fluorescent yellow CDC if I can't. And the other thing I do is, if it's a light background, I'll often use dark CDC for my flies and use a bit of very sparse coating of Roman Moser Miracle Float gel as floatant. And if it's a dark background, I'll use light CDC, light tan, and I'll use hydrophobic fumed silica white powder as a floatant, so that it shows up that little bit better. And to be honest, I don't have serious problems, but you've got to know where your fly's landed. So you've got to be an accurate caster, so you can actually look at the spot where your fly lands. But the alternative, of course, is to do what I've done when fish have been taking nymphs just subsurface. I'll sometimes fish a spider on a very short dropper and a visible dry fly on the point, fishing sort of washing line style. And I won't be able to see the spider, but I can see the dry fly. If I get a swirl nearer to my rod than the dry fly, I know that it's taken that, or the dry fly sometimes get dragged under. And I can also fish in a visible dry fly and the spider or a very small dry on the dropper. I can see when drag's set in by watching that bigger visible dry fly. But I'll always put the bigger dry fly on the point, because if you put it on the dropper, you don't get turnover of the smaller fly.
Wow, that is a lot of great tips there for people wanting to fish smaller flies, and that idea of the CDC colour, given the background, the dust as well, I think it does highlight it a little bit more as well. Before we move on, what sort of tippet then should people be thinking about when fishing these super small flies?
In theory, as thin as possible. I've given the choice, I'll fish a soft 2-weight rod or 1-weight rod or even the 0-weight rod and 0.09 millimeter. I don't usually go down to 0.08. I don't want to be leaving hooks in fish, even barbless hooks. I see no point in fishing too light. But I have fished size 30s on 5X tippet on Driffield Beck where there's big fish. And I use Gamakatsu C12 barbless midge hooks, which are very, very strong and have got big eyes, so you can get 5X tippet through the eye. But if I have to use thick tippet, I'll tie the fly into a Rapala loop knot. It looks awful with 2 lengths of nylon coming out and a great loop, but it allows that fly to articulate relatively freely, and it works. And I will sacrifice presentation to avoid losing big fish. A couple of days back, I was fishing with a friend, and we were fishing for some very big wild trout. I was fishing a mayfly on 3X tippet. He was fishing on 5X. He actually caught more fish than me and bigger fish than me, but he got broken once. So I would rather sort of catch fewer fish and not risk losing the fish of a lifetime or leaving hook and nylon in fish. But yeah, the finer tippet you can get away with, and long tippet, because when you're fishing really fine tippet, even with a soft rod, when you get a fish plunging under the rod top, the main shock absorber is the tippet. And I never get pre-stretched super strong tippet. I actually use Reflow Power coarse fishing line because it's very stretchy. So it acts as a shock absorber. The other alternative, of course, is to fish with a furred leader, which are also very, very stretchy. But I'm not mad keen on furred leaders for various reasons.
Again, some fantastic tips. And I was thinking about one of those things as well, about where I fish. Sometimes there can be that bigger fish. I'm like you, I don't want to stick a fly in a fish, and that Rapala knot tip is a great one as well. So I'm sort of, again, mentally planning my trip tomorrow, and, having spoken to you, thinking about those situations, and I've got a box full of small flies that do come out, and I do use them, and they're successful as well. And that Rapala one is a great one. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I mean, an alternative to the Rapala knot is you can actually tie them into a perfection loop. So, some people might, if they can do perfection loops well, they might prefer to use that, because that's the other thing. I on my tapered leaders, and I often use a 15-foot tapered leader with an extra 3 to 5 feet of tippet. I always put I use tapered leader down to about 3x or 4x, put a tiny perfection loop, and then I can add whatever tippet I want. I can change from fishing a size 30 dry fly to fishing a streamer on 3x tippet just by changing the tippet that's attached to that leader. And I must admit, recently I've been using flat butt leaders, which I find are very, very supple and float well and cast well.
Nice. Are they the Varivas ones?
Yeah. And there are some available from China as well that are a bit shorter, because the Varivas ones are 15 feet. Now, I usually use the 15 feet ones on Driffield Beck and then add extra tippet. On the smaller streams, slightly smaller streams, I'll actually use a 15-foot Varivas to 6x or 7x and cut it back a bit. So I've got maybe a 13-foot or 12-foot leader and then add extra tippet. Even on the tiniest streams, I very rarely go with leaders shorter than 9 feet.
Yeah, great advice, great tips once more. I wanted to, before we move on, because time is moving on now and we've spoken for over an hour, but I wanted to start winding things down. But judging by the conversation that we've had, that you're a well-travelled angler, you've mentioned Slovenia, Austria, New Zealand. Do you have is there a dream destination, a place that you would love to go fish that you haven't, or somewhere that you would love to go back and visit again?
Yeah, I think I would, if age and money and everything else were no limitation, I would quite like to go to Iceland, because you can catch big trout on dry flies. And the Icelandic trout feed on tiny midges. So it would be interesting to catch a 7-pound trout on a size 30.
That sounds fantastic. We're running a film competition at the moment, and somebody sent me a film about a trip in France, I think it was, but I happened to look at their YouTube channel and I was talking to him, and I said, thank you for sending it. And I watched the submission film, and then I saw Iceland, and funnily enough, he did exactly that, and it looked fantastic. And I said how the fish that he caught looked like a New Zealand trout, actually.
Yeah, but I've got to the stage now where I just enjoy fishing pleasant places, and the little moorland streams on the North Yorkshire moors. If I was told I couldn't fish anywhere else, it wouldn't worry me. I view a 13-inch trout there as equivalent of a 4-pound one from Driffield Beck.
Yeah, I'm with you on that as well. It doesn't matter, and it gets harder and harder to be dragged away from my home river, I have to say, but there's no place like home. Dave, it's been wonderful talking with you. I think we could have done at least another hour. If people want to get hold of you, if they want to find you, you mentioned Facebook, you're on Facebook. How do people find you? You on Instagram and stuff like that too?
No, I'm on Facebook, and other than that, it's just email.
And what's your email address?
All lowercase, Dave, Daver, Southall, Southall, @gmail.com.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And it'll be Dave Southall on Facebook as well. Dave, it's been wonderful to catch up with you. It's been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you for so much fascinating insight and information that I know listeners are going to take a lot from today. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
My pleasure.
Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for the messages. I'm so pleased that you're enjoying this as well. As ever, there will be plenty more episodes of the Fly Culture Podcast coming very, very soon. Thanks so much for listening.
The Fly Culture Podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.